In this portion of the build along, I'll go through the final rough out. I'll start by reducing the limb width one more time. I reduce it to 1 7/8 inches wide out to mid limb, tapering to 3/4 of an inch wide at the tips. This is another opportunity to correct any alignment issues since you have a clear picture of the growth rings on the belly. Now I will lay out the taper for the limb thickness on the side of the limb. I divide the limb up into quarters, starting at the fade, working out to the limb tip. I will make 4 marks along the side of the limb. Starting at the fade, I'll mark at 5/8 of an inch, and at the next quarter working towards the tips, I'll mark at 9/16 of an inch. At mid limb, I'll mark 1/2 inch, and the final mark I will also mark a 1/2 inch. That little bit of extra thickness will allow me to steam the limb tips and add some reflex to the tips. It's important to try and make sure the area you are steaming has been reduced down to 1 growth ring. Next, I start the material reduction on the belly side of the limb. Like the limb edges, we will work both sides of the limb down to the line on each side of the limb, leaving a bevel in the middle. I will then remove this bevel and make the limb as flat as possible. As you start removing the bevel, you will notice the way that the growth rings start to feather out along the belly towards the tips. I then use a coarse, rounded file to shape the fade and a finer file to clean it up. I then make a reference line on the back of the bow where the handle section will be. I make a slight reduction so the handle area is a little thinner and easier to work with. I do this by working from either side with the draw knife and meeting in the middle. You can then clean the handle up with a rasp, followed by a card scraper. Now the bow is ready for some steam and a little reflexing. I fill a pot with water and put it on a hot plate. I then use a dish towel folded over several times to go around the rim of the pot. I position the bow so the limb tip is in the pot but not in the water. I then cover the pot with another dish towel. I turn the pot on and start a timer for 45 minutes. After the timer is up, I remove the bow and place it in a jig that I made for reflexing and recurving bows. I got the idea for the jig from Clay Hayes. I modified it slightly so that I could slide the arm over the entire radius of whatever curve you are using. I clamp the bow in the jig and allow it to stay there until it cools, and then I repeat the process for the other side. This particular stave has a little propeller twist that you can clearly see. We will use some dry heat to take care of that. I will now use some dry heat to remove the propeller twist in this stave. I started by clamping the bow to a table at the handle and the opposing limb tip opposite the limb we are straightening. Squeeze clamps work good for this and make it easy to hold the bow in place. I place one of the clamps on the limb being corrected so that the arm hangs out to the side for a leverage point. I then tie a piece of paracord to the end of the clamp arm and tie the other end to a 45-pound kettlebell. Depending on the severity of the twist, you may need a heavier object or a fixed point. I brush a little olive oil on the limb and start heating it up, going up and down both sides of the limb. I slowly start moving the kettlebell in the direction I want the limb to go. I usually do this for 15 to 20 minutes. You will start to see a slight darkening of the wood, which is nothing to worry about. Later on, I will do a deeper heat treatment of the limbs, which will yield a much darker color. I try and go slightly past where I want to be to account for a small amount of springback. As you can see, the before and after pictures, this worked pretty well. The last thing we will do to the bow before tillering is thin the tips and cut in some temporary knocks. I start by scribing a line along the edge, starting about a quarter of the way back down the limb from the tip. I gradually bring the line in on both sides so that I leave the tip about a 1/2 inch wide. I then use my draw knife to get down to the lines on both sides of the limb. I then use my Shinto rasp and card scraper to lightly round over the limb edges. Lastly, I take some 80 grit sandpaper and smooth out the limb edges. Now we are ready to cut in some temporary knocks for tillering. I measure 1 inch down from the tip and mark a line all the way around the limb tip. I then mark a 45-degree line back towards the limb tip. I use a Japanese crosscut saw to carefully cut along this line about a 1/16 of an inch deep. I can now take a razor knife and remove this small section of wood from the tip. You need to be careful if using this method that you don't press too hard with your knife, or you will end up going past where you want the wood to be removed. Next, I take a rat tail file and deepen the knock at the base of the cut. I allow the file to wrap around to the back side of the limb, but not quite to the center of the limb. Now that the grooves are cut in on both sides, I round over the edges on the knocks. The limb tips will be further refined at a later time. Next, I will move on to the tillering phase of this build along.